This week, we've got two stories to talk about. A Supreme Court ruling that struck down some of New York's pandemic restrictions on places of worship, and the assassination of an Iranian nuclear scientist. Both are stories that caused a lot of uproar, and it's worth understanding why and the nuance behind what comes next. I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. So let's start with this Supreme Court ruling that technically put a stop to some pandemic restrictions on religious institutions in a case brought by the Catholic Diocese of Manhattan and an Orthodox Jewish organization. And yes, there is a reason why I'm saying technically and some. And for a little more context on why this matters, when this ruling came down, it sparked a lot of anger. From glancing at Twitter and headlines and honestly being too busy with school to read up more at the time, I was under the impression that this ruling straight up opened the floodgates. Now anyone could say arguably life-saving and essential restrictions should be thrown out because of alleged religious discrimination, and the Supreme Court would say, sure, why not? Which is an infuriating idea, because those restrictions are there to save lives during a pandemic that has already killed over 270,000 Americans. There was also heavy Jewish infighting online on the topic, with many Orthodox Jews celebrating the ruling and many non-Orthodox Jews being very critical of it and critical of the Orthodox community that was willing to sue for the ruling. So it's creating a lot of latent anger between parts of the Jewish world and a lot of finger-pointing over who is taking safety seriously and who isn't versus taking religious freedom seriously. The thing is, this ruling is not so clear-cut. But before we get there, there's some relevant, if sort of redundant, background to understand. Since the pandemic began and state governors have imposed all kinds of lockdowns and restrictions, there have been religious institutions, usually churches, suing on First Amendment grounds to get rid of capacity restrictions. The argument has been fairly straightforward. Places like grocery stores and liquor stores are considered essential and are open under many governors' pandemic restrictions without a capacity limit. And yet, places like churches and synagogues have had capacity limits imposed on them, so this must be religious discrimination by the government to treat secular and religious establishments differently and getting in the way of religious expression. Well, the Supreme Court for a while didn't really buy that, and in a series of rulings in the spring, they came up with a different approach that went like this. Religious institutions are places where a lot of people tend to gather and spend time together. In this way, they're more like theaters or concerts and not like grocery and liquor stores, where a lot of people may cycle through, but they don't typically stay there for a few hours to stand close to each other and do a bunch of singing, for example, which, I don't know, maybe Trader Joe's does a flash mob every once in a while, but we're talking about the typical example here. So the Supreme Court looked at those comparably secular places to see if there were the same capacity restrictions. Say only 25% of a theater's capacity could gather, and if there were the same restrictions on religious institutions, then there's no discrimination. If all the large places where typical activity is lots of people gathering and hanging out, if all those large places are similarly restricted, then you can't say your religious freedom is being violated. For some people, and I'll be honest, I'm one of these people, that sounds great to me. I am okay during a pandemic for religious institutions to be severely restricted in their capacity. Places where people gather are places where they get sick. But that doesn't fly so well with, to be blunt, more observant communities. Zoom can't do everything, and Zoom definitely can't do everything for Orthodox Jews who don't use electricity on Shabbat, for example, and in-person religious observance to some communities is also an essential need from their perspective. So seeing liquor stores be open but synagogues and churches severely restricted feels like a slap in the face. Well, the Supreme Court didn't start seeing their way until this ruling about New York that came down on November 25th. The relevant details here are that New York's governor, Andrew Cuomo, has the power to declare specific areas of the state a yellow, orange, or red zone. Each designation comes with a specific set of restrictions to get the spread of the virus under control in that area. Yellow is the most relaxed, and red is the most extreme. For orange zones, all houses of worship were restricted to 25 people maximum, and for red zones, that restriction was 10 people maximum. For yellow, however, the restriction is different. It's based on 50% of the capacity of whatever the building is. So orange and red zones have some pretty severe caps. And for a time, some churches and synagogues were in those zones. And that's what the Roman Catholic Diocese of Brooklyn and the Orthodox Jewish organization Agudat Israel of America were suing the government over. Their argument, well, religious discrimination, because secular institutions like essential businesses don't have these hard number capacity restrictions. But to complicate things, right before this case reached the Supreme Court, the governor actually redrew the zones to make it so that the churches and synagogues at issue in this case were all in the yellow zone. So the governor could then argue, hey, this case doesn't mean anything anymore because there's no fight. There are no religious institutions in the red and orange zones with the heavy restrictions, so there's no need for the court to rule about it. But in a 5-4 ruling with Amy Coney Barrett, a Trump appointee now in the seat once held by liberal Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the court didn't buy Governor Cuomo's shenanigans. The majority ruled that because the governor could redraw the zones again at any time, there needed to be an answer to the issue of the severe restrictions in the red and orange zones now. And the majority ruled that those severe restrictions, the 10-person cap and the 25-person cap, violate the First Amendment and can't be enforced because they are stricter than the restrictions on many secular institutions. In this case, those secular institutions used for comparison were the grocery and liquor stores, and not the comparable to activity places like theaters, which the Supreme Court originally used to decide these sorts of cases. What's notable about this is that, again, at face value to a lot of people, this sounds terrible. You can use a First Amendment argument and a religious freedom argument to negate life-saving restrictions during a pandemic. Not so great. But this ruling didn't quite do that. It was very narrow. It didn't say, okay, now in a red zone, COVID-19 hotspot, everyone can, go to church, pack the pews. It only struck down the hard number caps, but not the percentage caps. So for example, in a red zone, there's still a restriction on houses of worship to 25% of their normal capacity. So there are still restrictions. They weren't eliminated. And to top it off, this is a ruling specifically for New York, and it's a temporary ruling at that, as this issue is actually still being hashed out in the lower courts. So again, why is this important? Because I know this must sound like a lot of legal nitpicking. And, pound of salt, because I'm not a lawyer of any type, but I think the implication is pretty clear. There is a greater chance for the religious argument to be used against pandemic restrictions that arguably are essential and life-saving. There are other cases trying to reach the Supreme Court to strike down other restrictions in several states following a similar argument as the New York case about religious discrimination. If more and more pandemic restrictions are struck down in much broader ways than in this case, that could result in more infections and more deaths and a more dangerous environment for all of us. None of this happens in a day, and if that's where we end up, we do need to understand how we got there. But the Supreme Court has not set us up for this slippery slope, at least not with this New York case. This ruling was about some ultra-specific restrictions, not about the merit of any and all pandemic restrictions on religious institutions. And I think it is important to understand the difference. Honestly, I don't love the precedent here. I don't like the Supreme Court coming in during a pandemic and striking down state efforts to rein COVID-19 in. I don't particularly like Jews being such a high-profile part of a case like this. I also do think it's irresponsible to be fighting these restrictions when we know there is a serious problem in some, not all, but definitely some Orthodox Jewish communities in New York when it comes to taking the pandemic seriously. But we have to stay level-headed, and we have to be clear on what really is going on. Again, could this case be the start to religious freedom successfully taking down all kinds of pandemic restrictions? It could be the start if other cases follow and have much broader rulings than this one. But with just this case, we're not there. Now, before I move on, again, I am not a lawyer. I'm just a journalist who read the ruling. So you don't have to take my word on any of this. But in the podcast notes is a JTA piece by a real lawyer breaking down what this case means, and I highly recommend you read it. There are also other opinion pieces by real lawyers out there. So feel free to do a Google search and dive into what I'm sure and hope are all kinds of informed views on this case. And, the ruling is only 33 pages, so if you want to read it yourself, the link is also in the podcast notes. So with that, let's move on to our next story. Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, an Iranian scientist commonly referred to as the father of Iran's nuclear and missile programs, was assassinated on Friday, November 27th. There are conflicting reports about how it happened, whether he was ambushed by a group of assailants or killed by a remote control gun mounted on a car. The remote control gun story seems to be some weird misinformation pushed by Iran's intelligence agencies, but the point is, the how isn't totally clear, but the who pretty much is. Israel has been responsible for the assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists in the past, and though there's no official confirmation, Israeli political and defense officials are practically bragging about killing Fakhrizadeh in Israeli media and the New York Times. And to be clear, when I say Israel and Iran here, I mean the political and military leadership, the people calling the shots, not like every single citizen in the country. I hope that's clear. Now, why does this stuff matter to the Jews overall? First of all, because Iran doesn't take this stuff lying down. A high-ranking, very important scientist was killed by Israel, and Iran is going to respond. The thing is that Iran's response is rarely targeted just at Israel specifically. Any Jewish community in any part of the world is fair game. So basically, this situation turns into a security threat for Jews everywhere. It's happened before, and it'll probably happen again. If you do want a grim but potentially reassuring perspective on this, here's what Greg Carlstrom, the Middle East correspondent for The Economist, tweeted about Iran's likely response to the assassination. Quote, "Though Iran may well want to respond, it's often not very good at it. One of the guys released in a prisoner swap this week blew off his own legs trying to attack Israeli diplomats in 2012. End quote. So, unfortunately, the repercussions of this are something to watch out for, though Iran might not do anything even for, a few years. So given this risk, you might be wondering why Israel decided to assassinate Mohsen Fakhrizadeh. And that seems to be kind of a tough question to answer. Iran has enough nuclear knowledge and knowledge of missiles that the assassination won't stop it in practically any way. These programs are not dependent on one guy. This is not going to set back Iran's efforts to get a nuclear bomb. The prevailing theory about this assassination is that Israel did it to throw a wrench in future U.S. negotiations with Iran. President-elect Biden has made it clear that he wants to try and re-enter the 2015 Iran deal, which cut back Iran's nuclear program in exchange for easing sanctions to provide Iran access to lots of money, basically. Now, the Iran deal is a whole discussion to be had, and honestly, when this semester is over, I do plan to do a podcast episode that is just a huge deep dive on this. But right now, the important thing to understand is that Israel's political leadership is strongly against engaging Iran in any diplomacy, and instead is for a policy that President Trump has gone for, typically called maximum pressure. Maximum pressure is about boxing in Iran with heavy sanctions and being more aggressive with these sorts of military hits and assassinations to try and weaken Iran and bring it to the negotiating table by force. So things are going to be pretty tense between Israel and the Biden administration over how to engage Iran. And to get a leg up, it would make sense to assassinate a high-ranking Iranian official. Iran doesn't want to look weak, so then there's less of a chance of them rushing into Biden's diplomatic outreach after, having a top scientist assassinated. The thing is, it's not like diplomacy is going to just end because of the assassination. If you want to read a really good piece about this, there's a link in the podcast notes to a foreign policy story that I'd highly recommend taking a look at. But Dennis Ross, in a sort of conflicting opinion, an American diplomat and author who has spent a few decades working in Washington, D.C. on Middle East affairs, doesn't think this was done as a welcome gift for Biden. On Twitter, he said, quote, "One can debate the logic of killing Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, but to argue it was done to frustrate the incoming Biden administration ignores reality. Such an operation takes extensive planning, having operatives on the ground, actionable intelligence. It can't be spur of the moment." End quote. Which, not that I'm in a position to argue with Dennis Ross, but previous reporting on Israel's assassination operations, particularly in the book Rise and Kill First by Israeli journalist Ronen Bergman, points to the fact that some of these operations are the "we've got one chance, take it or leave it" type, and other operations are "we're following these guys and can strike at almost any time" type. So it's not exactly impossible that Israel would have Fakhrizadeh under surveillance and then go ahead with the assassination now because of broader motivations. What we seem to be left with on the face of it is an Israeli victory and an Iranian embarrassment, but, and this may just be me trying to also make sense of all the reports and the experts saying stuff, but this event doesn't really seem to get anybody anywhere when you actually do the math. But I guess we'll see what happens. Two things are for sure. Iran will find a way to respond, and the Iran deal and any Iran negotiations are going to turn into another huge dividing issue in the American Jewish community, like they did a couple years back. This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringaus. Don't forget to subscribe and share, and hopefully next week the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com.